Indonesia forges ahead to become an economic powerhouse. Many of its citizens are being left behind. Among them, over 200,000 children who live and work on the streets. Every day they face violence, sexual abuse, exploitation and discrimination. I'm FAUZIAH IBRAHIM. On this edition of 101 East, we look at the complex issues surrounding Indonesia's street children. They are the faceless thousands who have become part of Indonesia's landscape. Living on the fringes of society, their presence is hardly seen or felt. Together with their families, and sometimes alone, they live by the mercy of the streets, overlooked by a society struggling with their own survival. These are Indonesia's forgotten children. But in January this year, the plight of the nation's street children was suddenly thrust into the headlines. 9-year-old Shah's body was found mutilated and decapitated in the capital, Jakarta. Soon after, a cigarette vendor named Baikuni was arrested for the murder. Nicknamed Babeh, he had long been known as a father figure to street children, often providing them with food and shelter. He later confessed to at least 14 other rapes and murders of young boys who lived and worked on the streets. The killings led many to wonder how, after years of political reform and economic progress, the nation's most vulnerable citizens remain neglected. Government figures record at least 232,000 street children in Indonesia, with most of them in Jakarta. That figure is estimated to be much higher, but because of the transient nature of these children, it's difficult to gauge a correct statistic. But just how did these children end up on the streets in the first place? It's a question I put to AGUSMAN, a trained sociologist who runs a shelter for street children.
Hampir 90% faktor.
About 90% of street children are not there because of their own accord, but because of the poverty of their parents. In Indonesia, there are 3 categories of street children: on the street, off the street, and vulnerable. The first category refers to those who have nothing to do with their families because they either come from broken homes or are orphans. So for 24 hours they live and work on the streets, in the railway station, etc. The second category refers to those who live at home with their families but work on the streets to help earn money. And the third refers to those kids mainly from poor families who mix with street children and, if not guided properly, could become street kids themselves.
AGUSMAN's shelter mainly caters to the second and third category of vulnerable children. These neighborhood children are from poor or single-parent families struggling to make ends meet. AGUSMAN says parents often don't see education as a priority, preferring their children to beg or busk for money on the streets.
We are very proactive about visiting their homes and persuading parents to let their kids come here. And we have to be creative so that the parents can see the value of allowing their children to come to class. Our entry point is education. So instead of them going to the street, it's better for them to come here so they can get some guidance.
At the end of the class, these children will go home to their families. But in the next room, AGUSMAN attends to a couple of street children who have dropped in overnight seeking food and shelter. Homeless boys like these make up a majority of Indonesia's street children who often rely on the kindness of strangers. AGUSMAN says these children would often seek refuge with anyone willing to open their homes to them, making them vulnerable to abuse and exploitation.
Belum ada regulasi sampai saat ini.
Currently, there are no regulations to monitor individuals who open their homes as shelters. It is also not our place to be suspicious of such people who may genuinely want to help these children. So we hope the government will implement some regulations for shelters soon, so that incidents like Babeh will not happen again.
Living on the streets means living by your wits. Often, street children are bullied by adults or older street kids into handing over a percentage of their earnings as protection money. Or they're at the mercy of police raids and, if caught, can face time in jail.
These kids are actually very aware of the dangers they face living on the streets. Often there is violence not just among themselves, but from the community or authorities who see them as nuisance. There is also sexual violence, human trafficking, organ trafficking. Some have also been mutilated. The second challenge is the health challenges.
Mereka bisa juga terserang HIV/AIDS ya.
HIV/AIDS is prevalent amongst the street children because they are often sexually abused. They also turn to glue sniffing and they get respiratory problems from living near traffic.
We first spotted Ricky under a flyover lying motionless on the ground. We were not the only ones who thought he may have been dead, but his friends managed to rouse him from what we later learned had been a glue-induced sleep. RUKMAN SUWIRYA says glue is the drug of choice for many street children as it is cheap and easily accessible. He runs a small drop-in center for street children and tells me he has watched 13-year-old Ricky grow up on the streets and, like his friends, become addicted to glue sniffing. RUKMAN says he's tried many times to get Ricky and his friends to give up the drug and to enroll them in vocational training courses, but to no avail.
Basically, these children enjoy the freedom of living on the streets. They do not know any other alternative. I think it's mostly because of the nature of the way they live. There is no guidance, no structure in their lives. So they end up like that, sniffing glue, becoming drug addicts.
Ricky told us he left school at the age of 9 after his father died of influenza. He joined his brothers, sisters and friends on the street busking and begging. It was also then that he started sniffing glue.
I like sniffing glue because it is fun, and when my friends and I sniff glue, we become someone else. We become soldiers, we become rich, and we can help people. I love sleeping, eating, and living on the streets, and staying out with my friends because there is freedom and no responsibilities.
I asked him if he would prefer being in a foster home where he would get the comforts of regular meals and a proper bed.
I like it better on the street because I can earn money and be independent. I don't want to go back to school because I like living on the streets and I need to help my mom earn money.
Ricky's mother too lives under the flyover with her children. She says she has not known any other way of life.
Since I was young, I've always lived in this area. Back when we lived in the shacks, but when they cleared away the shacks to build shops and houses. So I live in this area, but now on the streets. Sometimes I get work peeling onions at the market, or there are times when I get to wash or iron clothes for people. But there is no work, I just hang out with the children. I tried forcing them to go back to school, but there were too many arguments. And then my eldest daughter got pregnant. I became a grandmother, and I spent my time looking after the children.
Ricky and his family are typical of the homeless culture, where it is not unusual to find several generations of families living on the streets.
This is especially so with the children who live with their parents on the streets, and this is the only life they know. They will have children born into the streets. If there is no guidance or intervention at a young age, then they will end up having their own kids on the streets.
With this continued cycle, it's no wonder the number of street children has risen over the last few years. Statistics show that in 2008 there were 8,000 street children in Jakarta alone. Within a year, that number rose to 12,000. This is the plight of Indonesia's street children and their families, forced to make their homes under flyovers and bridges like this, where they run the risk of being flooded out by storm water. But more importantly, without a fixed address, these children and their families don't qualify for identity papers, the same papers that can give them access to medical care and to education, further highlighting their non-existence in the Indonesian society. The general Indonesian attitude towards these homeless families appears to be one of indifference. Many say this attitude is reflected in the government's policy towards street children and their families. In January this year, the Ministry of Social Affairs said it aimed to clear all children off the streets of Jakarta by the end of 2011. We sat down with the minister and asked if this goal was achievable.
Yes, for Jakarta, God willing, it will happen in 2011.
When do you think Indonesia will be able to address the issue of street children nationwide?
Hopefully in the next 5 years. At the end of the period of this cabinet, God willing, there will be no street children anymore.
However, the issues are very complex. There are issues that are relating to poverty, education, broken families, dysfunctional families, bad company, also discrimination. Are you saying then that the government intends to address all these issues within the next 5 years?
It's not that they will all disappear from the streets, but we are going to do this in stages. Firstly, we carry out socialization approaches so that they feel comfortable to come to the shelters. We will prepare food for the children and will approach them so that they would like to go back to school. And lastly, we also empower the parents. We have several programs where we give them capital to start their own businesses. We empower the parents so that the parents can work, so that eventually the children will have enough time to go to school full-time and study.
But critics doubt the government's institutional approach will be effective and that more must be done to reach out to the street children.
I don't think they'll be able to do it. Even if the authorities try their best to achieve this in such a short time, they will probably have to resort to methods that may infringe on the rights of these children. In my opinion, the authorities should adopt policies that would persuade these children to get off the streets. For example, they should help shelters provide more activities for these children to occupy the time. But if they adopt policies that do not take into consideration the needs of these children, then that would be an unsuccessful mission.
Coming up after the break, we hear from one former street child who's turned his life around and is now helping other children in need. Stay with 101 East. In a society where many struggle to survive, there is no place for Indonesia's street children. Observers say the general perception of these children and their families need to be changed for their problems to be addressed.
From what I've observed, the government and society at large tend to see these kids as problems that taint the beauty of the city. So they approach the problem from trying to get rid of these negative stains. Also, there is a social stigma against street children, perceiving them as outcasts who misbehave. But it is the government and society's responsibility not to look at them as criminals, but to look at them as victims of dysfunctional families, of rampant poverty.
It is this problem of rampant poverty that drives these children out onto the streets. Street parents have been accused of exploiting their children to make money. After all, people would be more inclined to hand over money to a begging child than to an adult.
There are some who would argue against giving money to children like these. After all, it might actually encourage them to stay on the streets. But without a viable alternative income, these children and their families really have no other alternative but to turn to the streets to make a living.
We met 15-year-old Nurhayati busking at an intersection. She told us she usually busks in the morning before heading to primary school.
I started basking when I was 5 years old because I needed to help my family. If I don't bask, then we would not have any food to eat. I always give all my money to my mom. That money is used to pay off our debts for food. How much I earn depends on the people who feel like giving money to me. Sometimes they just ignore me.
Nurhayati says her best days are on Sundays when she can earn up to $2. On other days, she earns up to 50 cents, just enough to cover her transportation to school.
I like going to school because I like studying. My favorite subjects are English and mathematics. I'm not very good at them, but I really enjoy them. I don't know how long I will keep basking, but I guess I'll have to keep doing it until I finish my education or until the end of secondary school.
Nurhayati's father left the family years ago to remarry. He left her, her younger sister, and their mother to fend for themselves in a small shack.
We live from day to day, depends on how much the basking brings in. All I know is that we need to have $20 to pay rent at the end of the month. It's never enough. There are times when I have to owe the grocery store. Sometimes I have to borrow money for Nur to go to school. What I really hope is that Nur can finish high school and get proper work. But it all depends on whether we can have enough money to even send her to high school, because it's more expensive than primary school.
Mohammed Firdaus knows only too well the struggle of gaining a good education while living on the streets. Today, after obtaining a scholarship that led to a master's degree, Firdaus has opened an orphanage and school for street children. But he still remembers a childhood of selling cakes and newspapers on the streets to help support his poor family.
So this is where you would live then, Firdaus?
Yeah, I used to live in here.
Yeah. It's very small.
Yeah.
So how many of you would be in there?
2 of my parents, 7 my brothers and sisters. So that's why in the night I have to sleep outside of my home. I sleep in the field, I sleep in the mosque, I sleep on the street.
I see. And what would you do for food?
Not only me look for that kind of food, but also my brothers and sisters all together go to the garbage and then found rotten and broken foods. And then we fry it again, we cook again.
And that's the only way you could eat it?
Yeah, it's the only way that we could do to make us survive.
Firdaus says that even at a young age he was determined to make a success of his life and was careful not to succumb to the usual pitfalls that beset street children.
Pada saat saya justru ada di sekolah.
When I was at school, I mixed with kids from both poor and rich families, so I could see the difference.
Saya udah kapok hidup miskin.
I was tired of living in poverty and I wanted to get out of that cycle. I wanted to be a success, so for me, education became a priority. So at the time, being on the street was only a means to support my education.
Firdaus admits it is difficult to get these teenage street children to attend classes regularly. They face parental pressure to earn a living as well as peer pressure to enjoy the freedom of the streets. But he takes every chance he gets to press upon them the importance of staying in school.
Kalau mereka pergi ke sekolah, dia punya opportunity untuk.
If they have an education, they can have a better job, which then means a better wage, and from there they can change their lives. So that is the way poor people can break the cycle of poverty, through education.
While the government has vowed to make street children a priority, they're also asking for help from the community.
Saya tidak melihat ini masalah
I don't see this problem as the government's problem only, but it is a problem of all of the people of Indonesia, because they should see these children as their own, not as someone else's. So it's not just for the government to work, but also the NGOs, the community. I'm confident there'll be no more street children in the next 5 years.
And while activists welcome the government's efforts, they warn that measures must be taken quickly.
I would like to emphasize that these children are humans with similar rights as any citizens of this country. Their rights and their families' rights are protected by the Constitution, which includes access to health and education. So the future of the state, no matter how excellent it is, if we don't respect these children and protect their rights, we will lose a whole generation.
And so it seems that while Indonesia continues with its economic progress, it must take some time to reflect on those being left behind. As long as systemic discrimination exists, these children will remain as outcasts. As long as rampant poverty exists, these children will remain on the streets. And as long as their problems are ignored, these children will remain faceless.